What is going on, everybody? It is the Big Signorelli, aka the Big Sig, back at it again with another banger. Today is going to be a topic that I decided to do based off of just spur of the moment. It felt right, and just something to kind of recap on. It's also something that I did in the past when I first started doing the Lacan series by myself. And then when I met Nick and we started doing Seminar 1, we got onto this topic, which will be talked about on Negation, Verneinung. It made me rethink how much I know about this topic, because Verneinung is probably one of the hardest and most dense, not only concepts, but essays by Freud. So what we're going over today is on negativity. Negativity in Verneinung, which is translated as negation or denegation, as quoted in Seminar 1, the commentary that Jean Hippolyte gives in Seminar 1 on Freud's Verneinung. We have Verwerfung, which is foreclosure, which we'll get into in Psychosis. Be a little precursor, not as in-depth as I'm going to honestly give in the analysis of Verneinung, but I'm going to do my best. It'll be a precursor because we're almost done with Seminar 2, so that means we'll be getting into Seminar 3, so we'll go into Verwerfung more. So it's going to be a little appetizer. Then we have Verdrängung, which is repression, which plays into Verneinung a bit with the neurotic, right? Then it's in the clinical structure of neurosis that we get Verneinung happening. So we have Verdrängung, which is repression, and then we have Verleumdung. I think I'm pronouncing that one right. My German's not that good, but the English translation is disavowal, which is what happens in the clinical structure of perversion. Now, there's something interesting that Bruce Fink, American Lacanian, and I'm referencing from this text right here, Clinical Introduction to Lacanian Psychoanalysis, Theory and Technique, highly recommend. It definitely simplifies a lot of the concepts because they're dense, right? But he says in the beginning of Lacanian diagnostics, a Lacanian approach. I said l'approach. There's my Freudian slip right there. There's my parapraxis. There's a really cool thing that he says right here when he talks about the categories of neuroses, perversion, psychosis. He talks about the mechanisms, which I listed. So for neurosis, we have repression, right? Now, Verneinung is not a mechanism of repression, but we will get into that, or a mechanism in neurosis, but we'll get into how they play in. We have perversion, disavowal, and then we have psychosis, foreclosure. Now, he says in here that with these, that it's not that these are correspondence to the categories, but rather that they constitute the structure overall, that they are the cause. And that is pretty interesting. So we'll get into this right now, right? So, Verneinung, negation, or negativity, and how this ties in with not only neurosis, but repression. So, one of the main things about Verneinung and its negativity is that, well, for example, the classical story of the man in analysis that says, I had a dream about a woman, but I could assure you it is not my mother. And so, right there, we have an instance of something being negated within an affirmation. So we have an affirmation, and then we have a negation. Now, for Freud, and as emphasized by Alenka Zupančič in her essay regarding the importance of negativity and Verneinung, is that what we have is not the fact that, you were thinking about your mother and analysis. The problem is your mother. What we have right here is something that is not only affirmed, a woman who then becomes negated by saying that it's not my mother. Then what we have is not mother and mother. Well, then we have something that's radically different, which is the not mother. It's a lot. But what Alenka emphasizes is the critical thinking that Freud is realizing in how the unconscious manifests itself in this intellectual phenomenon, this linguistic phenomenon that Lacan will also emphasize and kind of put into play, because Lacan points out that Freud was savvy with language, but he didn't have a theory of structural linguistics. But he noticed that the unconscious manifests in these speech phenomenon. And so with Verneinung, negation, we're getting at an affirmation that is constituted by its negativity. And then the negativity is constantly negated again. We get into a formal logic of we have P, not P, right? It's an either or. But via the law of contradiction, or the law of non-contradiction, we can't have both at the same time, right? Due to the law of excluded middle, it's either or. But for Freud, it's like, no, both are existing at the same time. And so here we can see a parallel between that and possibly the Hegelian dialectic of affirmation, negation, and negation of the negation. And so what the unconscious is showing is we have something that is affirmed, but in its affirmation is constitutive via negativity. And then in the unconscious bringing this about, we have a further negation. So we're not thinking about the mother, right? But the mother, as a signifier, acts as a starting point through this radical negativity of finding out what the object is. We should kind of see this as also maybe substitution. So let's tie this back to repression. So I said affirmation, right? The German term is Beauhung, which is like a mythical, primordial affirmation, a revelation. Lacan will kind of tie this in with his early notions of full speech and empty speech, this being on the level of full speech. So let's talk about neurosis and repression, mainly repression. So we have to think about a baby, right, who has drives, doesn't have, instincts like an animal, referred to, Freud's theory of drives and instincts in the vicissitudes essay, and then even the mirror stage essay, and pretty much all of Seminar 1, where Lacan has emphasized that we are caught by the sexual lure. We have libido drives. We don't have instincts. So the baby lives in this kind of hallucinatory, imaginary register of being in relation to the mother. The mother is calling out to, it's pretty much answering its calls, its cries. It needs to be fed. It needs to be, it needs to have its ass wiped, all that. But mainly this autoerotism of eating and shitting are wrapped up in this relation to the mother. And it isn't until the name of the father comes in, which is a no of the father, that we have pretty much a negation. But to be more clear, what we have is a primordial act that brings this about as well. I mentioned the Biao-hung, right? Well, the Biao-hung reveals itself in these speech acts in the analytic session. For instance, the mother, not my mother, not mother. But for this moment of the instantiation of our subjectivity, we have an imprinting, which is usually a traumatic act, a traumatic kernel that is constitutive of us being in the world. The German term is Prägung. It's imprinting into the psyche or into pretty much our subjectivity. Lacan in Seminar 1 uses this metaphor of the striking of a coin, in which the face, of someone is put on the coin. Like, so when you look at a coin, like for instance, you'll see like the president's imprinting on there. So we should think about that traumatic moment, which is affirmative of an object, in relation toward the subject, which then creates the conditions for these clinical structures. For the neurotic, what we have is something that is affirmed but also must be negated and even substituted. Therefore, we have repression. So whether it's primary or secondary, I don't really want to get into, because that could just cause a whole thing. It's even a confusion that I've had that I've asked about with someone like Michael Downs of The Dangerous Baby. The difference between what Lacanian versus a Freudian talks about with repression. But needless to say, repression becomes the way that the unconscious manifests. And not only is there a substitution of what was being affirmed, but also there is this forgetfulness of it. We should think about the forgetting of being born, the forgetting of maybe even being, nurtured as a baby, nursed, breastfed. Not that these things are traumatic, but what is traumatic is the imprinting that affirms an event that then, for lack of a better term, interpolates us into the symbolic order at the same time. For the neurotic, again, it's the no of the father that pretty much, in the way that I really like what someone like Sam McCormick of Lectures Lacan emphasizes in his Drive series, is that what the no of the father says is, no, you cannot live without prohibition anymore. And so I also find that kind of interesting, because our entrance into language and to be speaking subjects, split subjects, is constituted of a no, and also of a negation of what we pretty much once had, was this immediate satisfaction of all our libidinal needs via the mother, which even then is not like this holistic thing. We never had this holistic jouissance. We're giving up pretty much a loss that we never had by this no of the father that demands, no, you cannot live without prohibition anymore. And so for the neurotic structure, we then get the chain of signifiers. We get the master signifier, which allows for substitution, but we got to think about the Lacanian math theme. I'm not going to go into too depth, but just the fact that we have a subject that is split, but it's already split from within and from language. And so this chain of signification are ways in which the subject is reflecting on itself, and these signifiers are different placeholders for the subject and identity. But mainly, the way that the subject itself is metaphorized is the term signifier for the subject of another signifier, meaning that the subject is always trying to account for itself in another signifier. If you've seen our Seminar 2 series, we were talking about this, the different combinations in which the subject tries to take account for itself. There's the infamous saying that Lacan talks about, like the subject accounting for itself, like the little boy saying, I have three brothers, Paul, Ernest, and myself. We should think of it like that. Now, we also got to think that it's not just this constant straight line of the subject just constantly trying to account for itself with different signifiers for other signifiers, etc. There is a point where it has to retroactively go back to account for itself. This is even how analysis plays out. It takes time, and within time, the subject is working through itself retroactively, retrocausally. But this time is not a chronological one, right? I mentioned retroactive, but we should think of it as sort of a right timing, a logical time of deduction. Also known, you could even think of it as chironic time. Now, what does this have to do with the whole thing of negation, right? It seems like I lost track of what we're talking about. I'm all over the place, but no, we're going to get to that. So, repression is like this forgetful forgettingness, and through language on the level of the unconscious, which is brought about through the repressive mechanism, we have metaphorizations of this lost object, of this substitution. Now, on the level of hysteria with repression, some of everything doesn't get accounted for, and so repression is never a complete thing. And so what we get in hysteria is conversions in which what just failed to be repressed will show up in bodily symptoms like migraines, headaches, dizziness, chronic pains, certain seizures or convulsions. I mean, the list goes on. We see this in someone like Anna O. But through the Talk and Cure, you start to put everything on the level of speech and work through. Now, on the level of obsessional, which pretty much the difference between hysteria and obsessional, even though they're both neurotics, it's like, think of it, one is always in this questioning of, am I a man or am I a woman? Obsessional is like, am I alive or am I dead? And if I'm not mistaken, with Verneinung and this substitution for the obsessional, it's usually trying to avoid castration, which is also equivocal to symbolic death. Not literal death, but a more substitution of literal bodily death, more of being cut out from the symbolic order and what it means to be man. Lacan talks about a logical time. At the end, we don't know what it means to be men, but in relation to other men, right? We have this anticipation within pressurized time in which we rely on the gaze of the other in this game to deduce ourselves as containing the truth of the real subject, the free subject. And if we're too late, we have this fear of pretty much being cut off, right? And so for the obsessional, we have different fantasies. They are trying to construct the object cause of desire within these fantasies. And so there's a lot that is left out, or even missing of that object, like the aim towards this object cause of desire is mainly to miss it, right? To fail at the aim and constantly circle around it and to go back, right? So I hope you're tracking along. If I'm not making any sense, please leave a comment down below saying, hey, Big Sig, you're all over the place, you're not making any sense. This is meant to be more of just like a free flow video of understanding the different negativities. I'm mainly going to focus on Verneinung, but I will flesh out the other ones like I said. So we're talking about Verneinung, and we're going to tie this into Verdrängung, repression. So what is pretty much being repressed, we could say, for the neurotic is this primordial object that is affirmed but at the same time negated in this imprinting moment, the striking of the mark that creates the subject via the trauma. Now, if you notice in the case of the Wolfman, we find through the dream of the wolves in front of his window that somehow this retroactively goes back to a moment in which a Wolfman as a kid, like as an infant, walks in on the parents having sex a tergo or doggy style. Now, it is not that this moment itself is traumatic, because this is the one thing that we have to differentiate between trauma as like, oh, some past event that happened versus something that is constitutive of our subjectivity, becomes repressed, but also is constructed retroactively, logical time, chironically, through signifiers. And these signifiers that are metaphors that create a mythic scene to bring about truth of the subject that is resisting metaphorization, that is resisting symbolization. We're talking about a truth about a subject that is creating a history, but it is a retroactive history that is bringing about these repressed signifiers that not necessarily have to do with what we would call real life. They do affect us, but we got to remember what Zizek and Lacan will say, that truth is structured like a fiction, that pretty much that without fantasy, there is no life, right? Our symptom, our fantasy is what constructs our reality, right? We're not these naive realist bros that think like, whoa, I got my stuff in my head and then there's reality as it exists out there. No, quite differently. So when we're talking about a traumatic event, it is something that is always causally, retroactively worked through within the fantasy, within these signifiers, through free association over time as in both time that it takes, the duration of the sessions, and logical, chironically, these specific punctual moments in which we say something more than we intend to say, or we have a Freudian slip. And in the case for Verneinung, being these instances of something that is affirmed within a statement but also negated at the same time. Alenka echoes the joke of a man going up to the barista saying, I would like some coffee without cream. Sorry, we don't have cream, but I could give you coffee without milk. So coffee is being affirmed, but within it, it's I'm probably going to fuck this up, but predicated by a negative. And so, but yet that negative is also negated because, of its absence. Like there is an absence of milk. So let's fill this in with another placeholder of without, or cream. And let's put in a placeholder of without milk. So we don't have cream. We are with without cream, but instead of giving you without cream, I'll give you without milk instead. So what this does is show how the function of negativity of these signifiers happen to both affirm that primordial affirmation of something that is constitutive of our trauma in both in our alienation and also going towards what Lacan would call separation, going into language, becoming pretty much, I use the term interpolated into the symbolic order. So, Verneinung is not repression, but this is like, you could say, maybe the effect that repression has, because again, repression is it's not 100%, right? There are things that escape that, and through the talk and cure, you're obviously going to pretty much excavate all these repressed memories in the form of signifiers. And so, you know, he says him as in Lacan talks about, or even Freud too, that this happens on the level of speech, but that there's also this, he'll say it in Seminar 3, this relation between Verneinung on the one hand and Verwerfung. Let me bring up the quote real quick for you. And it goes a little like this. There's a close relationship between, on the one hand, negation and the reappearance in the purely intellectual order of what has not been integrated by the subject, and on the other hand, Verwerfung, hallucination, that is the reappearance in the real of what the subject has refused. So, the intellectual order is probably, for lack of a better term, speech, and how these instances manifest something which is being negated, but at the same time being affirmed on the level of speech, and creates the starting point for analysis to occur. And that is because this affirmation primordially brings about a negation via repression. And repression is always returning. It's returning from the future. This chironic, logical time future of the subject always trying to account for itself. That which is not being integrated because of this resistance of symbolization, probably on the level of the ego, but also on unconscious mechanisms of repression, just on one level forgetting, but on the other of resistance. This resistance happens in the transference, then comes about in these speech acts. And at the same time, the subject and the ego of the analysand can't seem to identify or integrate these utterances in their symbolic order. So it's like still being worked through. Now, I want that quote to be our trajectory into Verwerfung. So in psychosis, what we have is this refusal, or what is once called rejection, of the primordial know of the Father from this, you could say, imprinting, this pragung. And so what makes psychosis possible, I am still unaware of, or it's still unclear to me. I still like to somehow refer to these the contingency and triggering almost like an accident or just by chance of drive, this as Lacan will call it, touche automaton, that creates the structure. Something like that of the imprinting could at once be triggering of hysteria, neurotic structure, phobia as a neurotic structure, and then we got psychosis. But the psychosis doesn't create substitution, doesn't take on the no of the father, doesn't take on prohibition. Therefore, that utterance of the no becomes negated and rejected. So it's like, hell no, I'm not going to take on the no of the father. But then what happens is that this negativity brings on this imaginary relation to the real, I dare say, in which, because there's no of the father, there's no unconscious, there's no repression. So foreclosure is what creates the structure of the psychotic. The foreclosing of that signifier, which brings in the no, brings in substitution, brings in signification, and propriety between different signifiers and in the signified, or just signification in general. So there's no metaphors for the psychotic. They don't have a hook onto language the way the neurotic does. So something like verneinung can't even happen. What we have are paranoid delusions and hallucinations on the level of the imaginary. So, and this happens because it's like, well, even before any of this, there is what Freud would call like necessary hallucinations. Hallucinations don't obviously entail a psychotic structure, but you could be a neurotic or a hysteric or something and have a sort of psychotic phenomenon, and on a one level doubt it, but still it affects you. But for a psychotic, they're certain that there's a meaning or truth to it. They don't doubt that the phenomenon of their hallucination. They think that it's like a message from a god. They could think that aliens are trying to, tap into their mind. The president is trying to keep tabs on them, the CIA, whatever it is. But the whole thing I was saying, that there's this primary process in which hallucination becomes viable for us as babies, since we don't have instincts. We're pretty much born prematurely. The demand to be fed, bathed, have our asses wiped, nurtured by the mother. These instances of being satisfied have a sort of process in which whenever we cry for more food, when we're hungry, we hallucinate that experience of this imaginary other that is whole and that has enjoyment, gives it to us. And so during the mirror stage, right, we get caught in this lure, and we're in relationship to a gaze. And later on in Seminar 4, Lacan will talk about the maternal phallus, right? The gaze of that, which creates the construction of the baby, the child. We have our imaginary relationship, this alienation of the ego, this ideal ego. And then we have, separation, which brings us into language, in which now we have the ego ideal that's fluctuating back and forth, that we have, as Chiesa puts it, Lorenzo Chiesa, he talks about in Subjectivity of the Otherness, we have ego ideal ideal ego as the sort of form that is built around the movement and trajectory of the ego ideal. So the ego ideal, which is how we relate to others, and symbolically in our relation to speech, comes back to construct the form of the image, the ideal ego, our idealized self. But the psychotic doesn't have language like that. And so it's caught into this sort of weird imaginary phenomenon in which it is constantly being triggered by delusions because of the way it gets caught in these weird mirroring relationships, and where it sees an other that is totally different and even alien, for lack of a better term. It could be paranoid. It could bring paranoia, and what's happening is, what was being refused then comes back in the form of these delusions on an imaginary plane, which for Lacan you'll emphasize in the Seminar 1 lecture, which is the commentary on Verneinung, that this is not an intellectual order. There is something similar in which both Verneinung and Verwerfung have a refusal and rejecting mechanism, but this is on the level of judgment for the neurotic and Verneinung, and it's something that is trying to integrate within an intellectual order, within the symbolic order. I think he just uses that term because he hasn't really built up the symbolic order like he will after Seminar 3. He uses that term. That's my speculation. But because the psychotic doesn't have language, right? The psychotic pretty much has what is being rejected and foreclosed. Well, we get this sort of invasion of these hallucinatory experiences that pretty much the psychotic, in their way of using language, for lack of a better term, think of them as literal, as certain, as having meaning. Like, I mean, Schreber talking about how, in some instances he doesn't have a stomach, but then when the nurse comes in with food, she comes in with a stomach for him to eat. God wanting him feeling like he's a woman and wanting to be fucked by God. All these delusions and stuff are not doubted, but are on this bestowal of meaning, right? So pretty much, before I go on to recap, Verneinung again is this negativity that relies on affirmation. Repression is the mechanism that is the driving force or the cause of neurosis, but at the same time we should see this as something, as Lacan will say, forgetful forgetting in Seminar 1, and then we could think of it as like how the unconscious brings forth a substitution for the object cause. Now, that's the way I see it. I could be wrong on that, but on the way that we should see it operate is like that for now. This is just like a 101 video, but if anybody wants to correct me on that definition of repression, feel free to. But the goal is just to kind of flush out all these concepts. And like I said, repression, was it primary repression, secondary repression? Those are all very complex. The difference is, secondary repression differs from primary repression because what's being forgotten are going to be like these, on primary repression, these like sort of hallucinations and primordial experiences of being young and without language, like this autoerotism. And then once you're admitted into language, then we have the sort of censorship and mechanism that pretty much forces all these contents of enjoying down on the level of the unconscious. What we're mostly think of today as repression, but it's not suppression. It's still a sort of unconscious mechanism that isn't like, hey, I demand you to not eat or like not have like some type of sexual enjoyment. Like there is a level of norm to it, like of adhering norms and not caving into your like selfish pursuits, but it's something that doesn't happen on the level of me thinking, oh damn, I need to repress this desire. No, it's something that is on the level of the unconscious that we are not even conscious of. But now I want to talk about the other one, the last one. So I talked about Verneinung, Verwerfung, which is foreclosure, and then Verdrängung, repression, tied in with Verneinung, since they both have to deal with the neurotic structure, and Verwerfung, foreclosure, has to deal with the psychotic. The last one is disavowal. That is on the level of perversion. Now, this one is interesting because at one point we could see the perversion as like an inverse of neurosis, because they both have an unconscious. There is castration that is involved as like this traumatic imprinting, but disavowal, and the way I'll describe it as like as Zizek actually describes it, as this gap between knowledge and belief. So like the classical saying, I know my mother doesn't have a penis, nevertheless I still believe that she has one, right? I know very well, nevertheless, right? It's a denial. And it's always in relation to this maternal phallus. Now, why that? What is the maternal phallus? Well, if we go back to what I was saying about, being in the gaze of the mother, well, we have this notion of like this like other that has enjoyment, that's fully embodied, but then the baby realizes that the mother, or this other that bestows jouissance, is lacking. But not only do they lack, they also desire an other that isn't me, right? And so when we're talking about the phallus, we're not talking about a literal penis. If you want a really good explanation on the phallus, I'll put the link down below. Michael Downs' Dangerous Maybes Medium blog on the phallus is really good. What we're talking about is sort of index, or like this index of what the other has, right? And so the maternal phallus we could equate with just the fact that the mother is endowed with all this enjoyment that I lack, but I'm getting immediately. Now, how this ties in with the pervert is that, well, the pervert disavows castration and refuses, in a sense, to sacrifice their enjoyment, and believes that they could get their enjoyment. They believe that they have their enjoyment. They disavow. Disavowal is like a way where it's like almost like repression, but at the same time they believe that they're getting enjoyment. They could deny the memory, the traumatic memory, or this memory that points out their lack, and still believe in the fantasy that they have of getting jouissance. Now, to bring this down to earth, there's a really good clinical case on childhood perversion in the reading seminars 1 and 2 of Lacan. It's the commentary edited by Jacques-Alain Miller, Bruce Fink, and a couple other people. Now, in this one, we have an instance in which is cool because it brings in to clarity all the things that I've talked about as far as Prägung and imprinting into this, right? This kind of, in a sense, a primordial beginning, but we're going to bring it into perversion. So this child is actually a case study from Ferenczi, someone who is Freud's student, star students. So I think this kid lived in Germany, somewhere in Europe. This kid is under the structure of childhood perversion and a case of sadism. So he has an obsession with chickens, and even at times believe that he is one, and he speaks like one, making the chicken noises, cuckooing and all that, cock-a-doodle-doo, and develops a fascination with him and a fascination for slitting the throat of a chicken. Going through analysis, you find out there is a time, probably like around the age of, I think like 3 years old, the child develops a fascination for hen houses. And with this, the child goes up to them, and I think it's at an aunt's house. I could be wrong. That they're at a relative's house. The mom is there. I'm not sure if the father is there, but the mom is there. And one day he goes into the hen house and is fascinated by the chickens. Well, decides to whip out his penis and pee right there. The chicken comes up and bites his penis. So right here, we have a traumatic moment in which there is an imprinting. And the child starts to cry. And then pretty much the mother comes, moves the chicken, right? And so what is interesting right here is we have this moment where contingency and possibility of the drive come about, in which, well, and it's funny because I'm saying this because it's compared to little Hans's phobia of horses from being bitten and his obsession with the horse's penis, I believe. Why this isn't a phobia is because what happens next is going to trigger everything, because the child doesn't yet have speech, and yet in this analysis later on has a hard time talking about things concerning, in elaboration, the obsession with chickens and the hen houses. But this right here shows how the subject and the signifiers S1 and S2 are sort of rejected out of the symbolic order of this perverse structure. You can hear my cat in the background. She's agreeing too. And so, hope you're tracking along. It is the fact that this kid doesn't have language yet. So he's still attached to the maternal phallus. The mother saves the child by grabbing the chicken and then proceeds to slit the chicken's throat. This event triggers a satisfaction of libidinal investment, and then the child, as the child develops language, starts to build a fascination of chickens, drawing the chickens, then trying to mimic this event. Spends a lot of time with the mother, and then the mother, he takes her to, or she goes to the grocery store and he demands chickens. All he wants to eat is chickens. And the mother gives him the chicken. And so he starts drawing again, and then there's a point where the name of the father comes in and the note of the father, in which he uses the father's newspaper, his morning newspaper, and kind of does the same thing, right? So he then starts to actually develop the act of slitting the chicken, of not only doing that, but what he does is he has to create this primal scene of being the chicken, cocooing, cock-a-doodle-doing, circling around before he grabs the chicken and then slits the chicken's throat. So I'm saying this because well, we're dealing with the level of perversion right here, but what he does in doing this is he becomes the object of desire and inflicts the castration onto the chicken, which the chicken is supposed to be him, but also he is trying to be the mother and satisfying the primal scene of enjoyment. The disavowal is on the fact, well, that the mother doesn't have this enjoyment. He realizes this, and I think he realizes this from the father, from whatever reason. But in analysis, he talks about how he's a chicken and how he'll then transform into a cock and then a coachman. Now, a coachman, for some reason, has a relationship to the father, how the coachman is better than the father. The father is supposed to be what is desirable to the mother. He realizes that the mother has an enjoyment, or has a lack and a desire for an enjoyment that isn't the child, and isn't going to pretty much be in regards to that fantasy of bestowing the chicken on him, of satisfying the needs, but that in order to fill in the gap of the mother, he will be the coachman. So what the pervert does is it realizes that not only does deep down the pervert lacks, but the other lacks. But that's fine. I disavow both because I strive to be an other for the other by being that object in the fantasy that I become for the other in the sadistic way. I will be the other for the other. That's the disavowal. And that's how that operates. And I hope you're tracking, but this is how it's supposed to operate for this kid who realizes the mother lacks, that the father lacks, and one day, from all this enjoyment of knowing what the mother does in this act of slitting the throat, he's trying to be both this double of him being castrated by having his penis cut off, this symbolic castration, him being the mother that satisfies the child, and then also in the satisfaction of this sort of perverse sadistic scene will one day evolve and be the other for the other. This is the whole point of disavowal, is that I don't want to sacrifice what I don't have. I get to choose the castration. I get to subject others to castration, and then I get to one day be the other for the other. This was definitely a very heavy episode. I did this spur of the moment, pretty much to kind of give like a crash course to test what I could pretty much spit off the top of the dome. Definitely a lot. I didn't cover as much as I thought I would, but for this amount of time, it's pretty good. If there was anything that was pretty much still vague, I highly recommend that you drop a comment, a question, or even a correction on any of the concepts that were fleshed out. So thank you so much. Please like and subscribe, but mainly follow the Theory Underground channel. Follow the Vanishing Mediator channel, because that's where Nick and I are doing all the work. Pretty much everything that we're doing, Lacan related, is all going to be on that channel, right? So follow, like, subscribe. Thank you all. Have a good night and enjoy y'all's symptom.